All right, now we're getting started with Chapter 3, which is over police organization and administration overview. All right, first of all, every police organization, I know everybody always thinks of a police organization of cops, but it's really not. When you get into being administrator, it's really interesting how it now becomes running a business, just like any other business or organization, instead of all the police cop work. Now, do you have to know it to run one? Of course. It would be like saying, I'm going to go run the making of computers, but I know nothing about it. Now, of course, with supervision, you have to be able to supervise on one hand, but you also have to know what you're supervising. Okay, so there's 7 things, and you do need to remember this, that go into, and there's a nice little acronym, to all the tasks that must be performed by administrators, and it's called a paused corb, because we have to have acronyms for everything. The P is planning, so obviously you need to be able to plan if you're an administrator. Organize, obviously you need to be able to organize. Staffing, think about it, you've got to be able to staff your organization, the police department, effectively so there's enough officers working. You can't just say, oh, I want them to be spread equally, because you have more busier times than other. So you have to make sure you staff it. You direct, you're a director, you coordinate, you're always coordinating stuff, especially in police work. You report. And finally, budgeting. There's a huge budgeting issue. You only get a certain budget, and you generally, by June of the year that you're in, you have to have your budget in for next year. So you're always looking forward to the future as well. All right, most police departments and organizations are hierarchies, and they are very similar to the military, so we call them paramilitary organizations. And the reason we do that is because they resemble pyramids. You have a lot of people at the bottom of the pyramid. So if you had a pyramid, a lot of people at the bottom, few people at the top, which is your chief or sheriff. All right, so here we go. Obviously, at the bottom are your line personnel. Most of your patrol officers, you have a lot of those. You have a few sergeants or corporals, or maybe corporal sergeants, even fewer lieutenants. And that's really where, when you hit the lieutenant stage, that's when you're very administrative heavy. You're doing mostly paperwork. And then you have a deputy chief. Sometimes this level is called assistant chief, or if you have a sheriff, assistant sheriff, deputy sheriff. At the top, you have a chief if you have a city, or you have a sheriff if you have a county. All right, so the typical characteristics associated with the paramilitary model are: you have a central command, very rigid differences among ranks and what you do, different terminology. It's a hierarchy, meaning you have a chain of command. I don't go, if I'm an officer, I don't go talk to my lieutenant or the chief or the sheriff about something having to do with work without going to, in order, my sergeant, my lieutenant, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, let's keep going. Okay, so the organization structure often fail to promote communication. So a lot of times you have that sheriff and chief at the top, and they don't really communicate sometimes with the line officers. So I've always found that your chiefs and sheriffs, or your lieutenants, or your deputy chiefs, or captains, or whatever that may be, depending on each organization, if they come down to briefings or they do ride-alongs, they tend to do better, because communication is important. I don't care whether you're in law enforcement, you work at Walmart, or within your own personal relationships with family and friends. Communication is key. All right. Patrol operations have long been regarded as the backbone of patrol. So patrol operations mean your patrol officers. They're out doing the actual job, and so everybody else really needs to be there to support them. And the way you do that is through communication. All right, now we have the investigation division. That's kind of called the glamour division, because you have a lot. Those are your detective bureau, or it might be narcotics that focus on narcotics investigations, or your gang division that focus on gangs, whatever it may be. They're doing investigations specific to a certain area, and they're generally not on patrol. They're not wearing uniforms, and they just focus on those investigations. All right, investigators, so your detectives, spend a good deal of time looking at crime scenes, a lot of interviewing, going through records and reports, photographing, collecting evidence, processing evidence, all that kind of good stuff. All right, also, police departments have what we call civilians. So depending what state you're in and how they certify officers, we generally have what's called sworn or commissioned officers, and then we have what are called non-sworn, non-commissioned, or civilians. So if a person is sworn or commissioned, that means they have been certified, they've gone through an academy, and they have arresting powers within that state. If they're civilians, that could be a 911 operator, it could be a person that works in evidence, or a person that works in records or crime analysis, but that person has not gone through an academy. They've gone through training, but they don't have arresting powers. All right, also, police departments are political, because if you have a chief of police, their boss is the city manager and city council. And as you know, that's political. Those people get elected, so they have to answer to the public. And if you have a sheriff, then that person gets elected. So it's always political in nature somehow. All right, your leadership. Okay, generally, if you have a sergeant, for example, you have to have a number of years of experience before you can test. Most departments, it's around 5 years that you have to have on in order to test to be a sergeant. And then generally, it's another 3 years on top of that before you can test to be a lieutenant. And generally above lieutenant, your captains, your deputy chiefs, deputy sheriff's assistants, they're appointed. Generally, they look at their evaluations that are done on them. They have to take a written examination, an oral board interview, and a lot of times they also have to do an assessment center. All right, accreditation. So when we're talking unions, professionalism, and accreditation, we got to talk unions. Really fast, you need to know that a police union is responsible for collective bargaining, and you need to understand collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is a group of elected officials on the union that are members of your police department that have been elected to president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, so on and so forth. They represent the bulk of the police officers, and they go and speak to the administration of the generally city or county, depending where the budget comes from, to talk about and to bargain how much officers are going to make each year, what the raises are going to be, benefits such as how much time off, how much they're going to get paid for overtime, and then grievance issues such like if an officer gets in trouble, what are the steps for that? So that's what collective bargaining is. All right, and I kind of go over it right here. I kind of told you over on the last slide what that was. So if you want to pause here, you can and look at this more. All right. Police departments cannot strike. It used to happen a long time ago, but in most contracts it state that they can't strike, because you can imagine what would happen if police departments were collective bargaining for a contract. They didn't like what was being offered to them, so they said, we're going to strike, like you see many people do in many different professions. You can't do that because we need to have our police and fire services. All right, if you do have an impasse, so you have the city or the county saying, we don't want to give you a 5% raise, we only want to give you a 3% raise. Then generally in every contract you have what's called arbitration. If you do have an impasse, because police departments can't strike, you have what can happen and go to arbitration, where whatever's not being agreed upon, both sides agree that an arbitrator will hear both sides what the issue is, and they'll make a ruling, and both sides have to abide by the ruling. All right, and then I go into here what an unfair labor practice is. You can go ahead and pause here and read through that. Also here as well. All right, accreditation. We have what's called CALEA. It's the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. You want to know what that is. Just like college that you're going to right now, SOU is accredited. It's CALEA comes around. It costs anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 a year for a police department to be accredited. And what that pays for is representatives of CALEA to come and make sure that policies and procedures are written down and they follow the IACP expectations, and that they are utilizing the best practices. All right, this ends chapter 3. We will see you for the next video. There's one more.